I'm Andrew Dubber, I'm the Director of Music Tech Fest, and this is the MTF Podcast. Birmingham musician Kris Halpin is a professional glovist, which is to say he's a live performer and recording artist, and his instrument of choice is a pair of Mi.Mu Gloves, the wearable musical instrument created by MTFers Imogen Heap and Dr. Kelly Snook. And the reason he uses the gloves rather than, say, the guitar, his original instrument of choice, is his disability. Kris joined us at Music Tech Fest Berlin back in 2016 to perform some of his original music live, and it came at a time when his use of the gloves as an accessible musical instrument was starting to become something of a real buzz in the media and public attention. And because of the way interesting stories work, the story of a disabled artist using a new, very cool, high-tech wearable musical instrument was interesting in such a way that it also raised awareness of the very cool music of Kris Halpin. And so now Kris has travelled the world performing on stages to audiences that love his tech and to audiences who love his music. But now, of course, we're in lockdown. So I chatted to Kris about the experience of making music when your movement is already restricted to a certain extent, and then a pandemic takes it completely away. From one of my hometowns, this is Kris Halpin. Kris Halpin, thanks so much for joining us for the MTF podcast today.
It's very exciting. I did wonder if they might ask me one day, and here we are.
Here we are at episode, what are we, 84, 85, something like that? And
wow, exciting.
We finally got around to you. But this is your history with MTF. I remember you being at MTF Berlin in 2016. That was cool.
That was more than cool. Yeah, that was a hell of an experience, wasn't it? The Funk House. That's like the largest purpose-built studio in the world, was it?
Something like that, yeah. It's phenomenal acoustics and all the rest of it. But we had you up there on the stage, but also you were sort of the interest of many a camera person and interviewer.
Yeah.
So you were busy pretty much all the time.
Yeah, that was fun. Paul Wu is a director who's done some stuff he's done some really big stuff actually with BBC Two documentaries and things, and he was making a film for the British Council about disabled musicians. And yeah, so he was following me around with a Steadicam all week, which, looked pretty odd. But yeah, that film came out. It's really weird how you probably know how those things work. We shot hours and hours of footage, and the final film is like 3 minutes long,
Yeah.
But there's tons of cool stuff in the can, which I think I've got somewhere. Yeah, it's good. Most of that whole year was documented really well, actually, which is, really cool. But I've just got piles and piles of stuff. The thing I keep... I've got this big sort of anxiety at the moment because I've been torturing myself flicking through these videos of like tour footage and stuff, and like with the lockdown situation and feeling like was that it? How is this going to work with travel and stuff? It's the Facebook thing when it pops up with like, here's what you were doing a year ago, and we were just going into lockdown, and then it's pictures of me at like Teamland Borderless in Tokyo with my gloves on. Like, I was really kind of rolling at one point. It's like, now I haven't left the house for 4 months. It feels really weird. Right. And there's no news. I mean, there's no thought. When are we going to be able to perform and go back to whatever our lives will look like in the quote unquote new normal? Because, playing live is my whole thing. That's how I put food on the table.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, have you made any adjustments on that? I mean, you seem pretty well set up to work from home for a lot of the stuff that you do. Working from home,
to a point. I think the thing that's been like a big bump for me is like I'm really firmly a live performer and a touring artist. So consequently, going into this situation, like a lot of people have said to me, oh, you can just put stuff on Bandcamp and that sort of thing. It's like, yeah, but I'm not actually that together as a recording artist. That's kind of the thing for me. So I looked into, dipping my toe in the whole thing. Everyone's doing I think everyone was quick to try and do some sort of live performance thing online. And I was like thinking, I'm just going to wait a minute for that, because I could see that production values were going to creep up pretty quickly, and jumping on your iPhone camera with your acoustic guitar was going to get old pretty quick.
Sure.
Steve Lawson, our good friend, he actually had a good blog post, I think, about this, saying, musicians, don't rush this. Don't try and start doing a Zoom gig on day 2 of lockdown. Get your head around what's happening first.
Yeah, for sure. But to be fair, you are a recording professional. You know how the gear works. It's not a particularly steep learning curve for you, right?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's really weird for me is that I have that frustration of being not a shabby producer in terms of what I've done with other artists, but there's definitely, I've learned a lot about myself in this situation actually, because there are some just kind of mental barriers. I'm really perfect. I used to think that having a perfectionist streak was a good thing, and I just completely now see how useless it is.
You're describing every recording engineer in history. You know that, right?
Yeah, and it's kind of like to have that bar as a producer, but the objectivity that you didn't write the song is one thing, but to actually produce yourself is really, really difficult.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, the last single that I put out for the first time ever, it was mixed by someone else. And yeah, the weight off my mind to hand that off and just be like, and then it came back and just sounded amazing. I was like, cool, right. This feels like a step. But of course, then that enters a whole other world of budget and time, and you get into a whole different thing. So yeah, it's weird talking about it because I do feel like in some ways quite naive as a recording artist, because wrapping my head around being a recording artist of myself, yeah, that's definitely a challenge. Mm. But there's stuff out there. Obviously, there's a few songs that trickle out, but the last 2 or 3 years, it's just been. My life was starting to look like a Casey Neistat blog. I'm just in airports doing my thing. It's been amazing.
Wow. Well, let's start at the beginning. I mean, we probably should have started with this, but to describe who you are and what you do for people who are not familiar with the Kris Halpin oeuvre.
Well, yes, I'm a singer-songwriter type person, cut from the same kind of cloth. In my college days, I was explaining to my partner only yesterday, weirdly enough, listening to Automatic for the People, saying, when I was 15, I think I thought I was going to grow up to be Michael Stipe. Uh-huh. And and massive Radiohead fan at that age. And yeah, just kind of in that world, doing my thing with really early on, even though I was kind of playing guitar and doing the very cookie cutter singer-songwriter thing, I was experimenting with beats and sampling at a really, really early age. I had like an Atari ST and like that kind of setup when I was, this sounds ridiculous, I'm talking like 8 years old.
Wow.
Like really, really early. I used to like sample breaks I had a CD player with that you could, if you pressed it just right, you could loop things. So I got into sampling that way and just copying it onto a cassette. So I was always trying to embellish the music beyond just the guitar thing. But then, that was all going all right. Tom Robinson was playing my stuff. But I have cerebral palsy, which has had an increasing effect on my musicianship. And it already had a big effect on what I could do in terms of playing gigs and stuff. I've got a mobility impairment, but also a hand impairment. And the very long story shortened was that the hand impairment was just getting much worse. And the going out and earnestly playing guitar, where are we now? 5 years ago, that was just getting really, really hard for me. I was really struggling in terms of not being able to play songs. I remember there's a song that if anyone follows my music called Ratted Me Out, that was kind of a song that people would expect me to play. And I remember a little acoustic thing in Coventry taking that out of the set because I knew I couldn't get through it. And I thought, okay, now I'm in trouble. And I thought, that started the process of thinking, it sounds awfully dramatic now, but it was starting the process of me thinking that maybe my career was kind of going to come to an end, because I was making a record as well, or trying to, and I was doing my first attempt at vlogging. So this is about 5 years ago, and I was vlogging the studio sessions for this kind of very Nick Drakey kind of introspective folk record that I was sort of playing around with at the time. And the vlog became not about recording, but about disability really, and about the hand impairment. I was just lots of footage of me just being incredibly stressed and scared and realising that I couldn't even record the parts, let alone, go out and play them live. So, it was a really weird, scary time. I would put on, as you do, you go to Twitter and you go, well, I don't know, that's what I think. I'll ask Twitter. I think, I can't be the only disabled musician. I can't be the only person facing physical barriers to playing music. So who's out there? And people kept saying to me, you need to talk to this charity called Drake Music in London. This is what they do. So I did. And that's when I started on the journey of playing around with accessible technology and trying to work out, could I circumvent these barriers to traditional instruments? So we started playing around with accessible tech at the time. We're just going deep in here, right? Is that what we're doing? Yeah. So, I've got to say, And this is something that's been talked about a lot at Drake Music, and something that people at Drake Music have said publicly. So I'm not kind of being disrespectful anyway. But to say I was underwhelmed about accessible technology at that time would be, you know, kind of an understatement. At the time, the idea of going from thinking of myself as quite a serious guitarist to moving my hand around in front of a light that could play a C major scale was pretty underwhelming. And Gowan Hewitt was the music tech wizard at Drake Music at that time, and he totally got this. He'd seen my music. He really got behind a song called Hand It Emotion, really tenuous link, you'll know, because it was shot in your old neighbourhood in Kings Heath, the video for that. Yeah. Many years ago, actually. That's a long time ago. 7 or 8 years ago. And like he was the first person who was like, you've really got something here. This is really great. Because I hadn't left Birmingham at this point. So to go to London and be told that I was doing something good, that was a really big deal. And it just was really incredibly good timing that Drake Music would also back themselves into a little bit of a fun but kind of scary corner for them, because they'd been talking to a lady called Kelly Snook, who was working with Imogen Heap at the time, developing the magical Mi.Mu Gloves, which Gowan had seen the gloves in action and thought, this is an amazing bit of accessible tech. And around the time, Mi.Mu had tried and not succeeded with a Kickstarter program to get the gloves funded. I'm just going to work with the assumption that people know what the gloves are for a minute, and we'll come back to the gloves.
I think we're at a point now where if you've been listening to the Music Tech Fest podcast for any length of time, you've encountered the concept of the Mi.Mu Gloves. I guess.
Exactly, yeah. So, yeah.
Can I interrupt with the really stupid question? What's cerebral palsy?
Okay, that's a good question. So it's a neurological impairment which manifests in a physical one. Your brain is damaged in such a way that you then can't control your movements in a useful. It obviously varies from mobility impairment to, you know, complete paralysis. In my case, I've got what's called hemiplegic CP. So one half of my body is primarily affected. So the right hand side of my body is pretty flaky, wobbly. I don't know what a suitable. I'm allowed to be on PC about myself, I think. Like it's just a bit rubbish and wobbly, and yeah, it's quite painful. What's weird about it is
that was going to be my question. Is there a great deal of pain associated with it? Because this is something that a lot of people don't talk about. We you can see and identify cerebral palsy in some extreme cases, but you don't know what's going on from the outside. So I mean, describe the experience a little bit.
Yeah, it's really painful, actually. And it becomes increasingly painful. I think one of the problems with CP is that the old kind of medical model of disability, looking at it as a kind of a physical kind of mobility impairment, but because the brain damage doesn't progress, it's been treated as a non-progressive condition historically, which is now slowly people are coming round to the idea that that's not accurate. Because as in my case, with my hand impairment, with the guitar thing and moving towards the gloves, as we'll pick up in a moment, there's wear and tear, you know? My body becomes less able to do things. My hand, when your movement isn't working right in the first place, I'm always, like, I've got so many injuries as a result of this because my brain can't, for example, control my gait very well. So because my gait's wobbly, I've damaged my feet, I've damaged my knees, I've got what's called a labral tear in my hip where some of the muscles have just like given up. And like, so the physical aspects become, they're super, really progress quite quickly. I mean, you know, I'm reaching a point where I'm like, how much mobility have I realistically got left in my life? It's this is a big kind of thing to think about. And it's pretty painful, and pain management is kind of the big sort of headline for my life at the moment, especially with the lockdown thing, because the most successful strategy for me has been to go swimming.
Right.
Which, of course, I've now not done for 4 or 5 months. And, that is literally kind of, really eroding my well-being in pretty profound ways, actually.
Right. Okay, so
there you go. There's my honest answer. Sorry, that was a bit blunt, but there you go.
No, it's exactly what we're after. But then you come across these gloves.
Oh, yeah, gloves. Well, I didn't. Drake Music did. And Gowan was like, so the way that Mi.Mu had decided to get around the Kickstarter not working was to do what they called the collaborator program. So they developed 15 pairs, and then they were selling them with view that people who joined at that point you'd be the pioneers, the first people to have the gloves, and it was £5,000 to have a pair. And Drake were really excited about this. And as Gowan once said to me in front of an audience, he was like, yeah, we were kind of looking behind the sofa for that $5,000 because we were just like, oh, we've kind of told them we're going to do this now. So it was a big gamble for them. Yeah. And then it was they ordered the gloves, and then it was just a really casual conversation with Gowan because we were at this point we were playing around with iPad apps and things, and I was still just not clicking with the accessible tech thing at all. And he was like, dude, you should just try out these gloves, man. I think it could be a thing. And I was like, okay. And then, he mentioned it again, and it was really sold to me as like, so there's going to be a party at Imogen Heap's house. We can have a few beers and chill, and we can see these gloves. Yeah, you come in. I was like, yeah, I'm coming. And yeah, it was that. And it was a bit of backstory. I was a massive, massive Frou Frou fan. Mm-hmm. So like, Imogen's had a big influence on my career anyway.
Wow.
Going way back. 2002 Details came out. And I used to work, here's another blast from the past for you. I used to work in the Virgin Megastore on Corporation Street, which you'll know. And I remember that record coming out, and that was just like my obsession. I was just, such a big influence on me. So it was like, right, this is a big deal, right?
So going for drinks at Imogen Heap's house was not something that was otherwise on your calendar?
For someone who was sort of used to playing to 10 people in a pub in Digbeth, and that was a big gig. Yeah, to be sort of whisked off and doing this whole thing. I think I've said many times, I did an interview with Wired, which came to be like a sort of 2-page spread, a massive thing, and I hadn't even opened the box to the gloves. Like the buzz of they're going to be used as an access tool was just like, yeah, that really captured people's imaginations.
Right.
And that's when Gowan was like, we'd had a beer, we were kind of chatting, and he was like, this is what I see, man. This is my vision, yeah? You, gloves only artist, the like headline disabled artist, this is going to be massive, man. Are you going to do this? And I'm like, yeah, I'm going to do it. Like I didn't really have an opinion at that point. I went there thinking like I could borrow the gloves for a couple of weeks and get a blog post out of it.
Sure. At that time, what did you think the gloves could do?
Yeah, I'm trying to put myself back there. So I think that I was just having just thoughts about, well, what could I replicate a part or something? What could I do that would allow me to at least... There was this sort of baseline of me going out and playing the guitar, doing the chords and the vocal, and it's very... it's not particularly original, is it, as a format? And like, how could I replace that baseline? Because I was struggling with the hand impairment. Could the gloves fill in that gap and just be... the chords or whatever? So it wasn't like super ambitious in terms of like where it went. I think the big thing for me with the gloves was that jumping very quickly along the timeline, it was really apparent that the best accessible tech should get out of the way. Like the access thing kind of left the narrative for me with the gloves really, really early, because what it became about was an artistic process that I just hadn't considered at all, because I was making records and getting more confident in the studio. And playing more instruments and using software instruments a lot. So I had, facsimiles of strings and orchestras and things in my records, and then going out and playing like C, A minor and G in a pub on an acoustic guitar. It was quite a scaling down. If you heard my records and then you saw me live, it's kind of like, you're trying to ride on the back of like, oh, well, it's kind of stripped down or whatever, but it's not serving the vision of the song. And it was like, suddenly I was like, wait, I can have the orchestras and the drums and the 10,000 overdubs on stage and play them all with the gloves. Well, that's where my head immediately went with it, which wasn't really what people were doing with them at the time. But I just went, oh, it's like a one-man band. Yeah, I could just have all the instruments on stage. In my head, it was like, what if I just took a drum kit and 2 guitars and synths and an orchestra with me? Well, I could do that, right? Because I could just use the gloves and do it. So that one-man band thing and that big production was the kind of light bulb moment very quickly, just like, oh yeah, that's what I'm going to do with them.
Is that part of the capabilities of the gloves? I mean, is it an expressive musical instrument in that way?
Yeah, totally. I think so. Imogen was doing a lot of vocal orientated stuff, which was kind of her thing at the time, and it was just really like beautiful stuff. I remember seeing on that weekend she did a demo where she sang a note and then she seemed to catch it in midair, and then she turned her hand and it was as if she was scrubbing the audio. And it was like this physical manifestation of like sound almost becoming this tangible thing that you could actually hold in your hand. Because she was trying to solve a really different problem, which is why she developed them. Because she was making this very electronic music, but in a singer-songwriter format. She's singing over that stuff. She's not a DJ. So, as she put it in her own words, she's like, you're watching a woman singing with a laptop. And for all you know, she's checking her emails. Like, why is the laptop there? Yeah. What's going on? Where are the sounds coming from? How do you manifest that in a visual way that means something to the audience? So that was the problem she was trying to solve with the gloves, and which she does beautifully. Obviously, we came at it with this view that it was quite accidentally an incredible access tool, because I can't, like my right hand locks up, and if I play piano, it gets quite difficult, and I can't move the keys on the piano to be where I want them to be.
Sure.
But with the glove, of course, I can do whatever my impairment needs.
Right, because this is the bit that I guess on the face of it seems confusing, is that in order to make accessible music performance for somebody who has hand mobility issues, you give them a glove. And that, to me, that on the face of it doesn't seem right. But how you described it then about putting the keys where you want them to be, that seems to be the key to it, right?
Oh, yeah, sure. It's not like what I started to get frustrated with is that for all my musical ideas, there's this there's a bottleneck in the sense that making music becomes ultimately, you can pin it down to a dexterity thing, right? Making music requires dexterity. There isn't an instrument very few instruments can be operated without operated. That's an unusual way to put it. Played, I'll go with played, but operated sounds more interesting. Most instruments need two hands, right? Two well-working hands, of which I don't have two well-working hands. But the idea that any movement could be valid with the glove. I mean, the glove isn't, and this is where some of the press at the time, I was grateful for the hype, but some of it got a bit distracting. There was definitely a narrative of like, hey, Imogen Heap solved the problem for disabled people. It's like, well, it's not that simple. Like, there will be musicians who don't have hands, full stop. A glove isn't always the solution, but it was a good solution for me.
Sure. For
someone with reduced mobility to go, okay, I can't do anything. I'm showing the camera, we're doing this in audio, but for your benefit only, I'm going to, like, can't move my finger so much on my right hand, but I could make a fist, and that fist could be a meaningful musical event. It could be an arpeggio, it could be a chord sequence, it could be something. So even the very limited movement, you take well, what can I do? And then you teach that to the gloves, and then you output what you want to do. So yeah, it made complete sense to me straight away.
Right.
That it was a good access barrier for me. Access solution.
So gloves aside, has accessible music technology moved on in the 5 years since you were looking at this?
Yeah, I think it definitely has. I think we've had a lot of interesting developments. One thing that, and I'm saying that all this about Drake music being completely on the record because it's all stuff that Gowan has said very publicly. They felt, and they're a wonderful organisation in the sense of self-analysis, and they felt that before they worked with me in an artistic capacity, they had a prescriptive approach, as they put it. So, and this was how accessible tech worked at the time. You would come up with something that you thought might be a solution, then you take that to disabled people and say, we've got this. And my work with them was the first time they looked really closely at, well, what do you need? And we tried different things. And yeah, it's just, I mean, obviously it's more than a bit fortunate that the glove thing happened at the time that it did, because I could be experimenting with other stuff for a long time. But what became in Drake music's language the idea of a bespoke approach, that you really had to listen and understand the individual's barrier, and there isn't going to be a ultimate solution to here's the accessible tech that everybody needs. And since then, what I've seen since then has been and where MTF kind of comes into this, is the bubbling of the kind of the hacker mentality of people, this partnering of people who just want to invent something cool and interesting and know their code, and they know how to make some kind of new musical instrument and some kind of new interface. And then there's disabled people they're like, well, we need new interfaces because instruments aren't designed for us. And it's been just such a beautiful marriage of minds, seeing how Drake music especially has really facilitated that connection between the right tech people with a vision of something, just to do something new often, and saying, hey, there's a whole community of people here who need something new. And that has been really exciting to watch. I mean, I've been involved in some really major projects with funding. We've been able to award funding to music, technologists to develop new instruments on a bespoke level for an individual, like, yeah, it's massive. And that getting out of the idea, I think at the time there was a bit of a, like, I'm not poking any fun at anyone else's technology, but there's a thing called a sound beam, which is ubiquitous in I hate the term, but what we call in the UK special education, which is kind of like what schools will buy as the accessible instrument. It relies on a light beam and you can move your hand and it can play some notes. And I'm certainly not saying it's not valid, but that mentality at the time of like, oh, this is the instrument that for disabled people was like, that's not really a reflection of the instrument, but there's a culture around that kind of stuff of like, oh, right, here you go, we've got that problem solved. And it's like, no.
We've solved that now, yeah.
Yeah, you need a much more bespoke approach. And that narrative picked up again around the gloves, which was really frustrating at one point, because I was like, yeah, it's really hard to articulate just how fast that story kind of snowballed in terms of like the interest in the idea of using the gloves to conquer an access barrier. I mean, it seemed so ridiculous. I mean, I was on BBC primetime news, like, you know, it was silly, the excitement, but there was also this undercurrent of like, well, they've fixed that. Cool. Hey, everybody, come and get your Mi.Mu Gloves. Disability solved.
Was there a nice knock-on effect for the popularity of your music at the same time?
Well, yeah. I mean, it was just really bizarre because I was playing to... so once I'd got the gloves and I'd got my head around how to play them, which is kind of... was funny in itself because I remember getting them home and sitting down to work with them, and it was just like, yeah, in my mind, it was just like QI klaxon, abort. It was just like, what have I done? I've agreed to take this like £5,000 instrument this charity's paid for. I've got one of my favourite artists like really like betting on me like this is going to be awesome, and I'm just sitting there going, oh yeah, I'll just play guitar, I don't know how to program this thing, I don't know what I'm doing at all. So I was, yeah, briefly way out of my depth because I'm not that, like I said, I was experimenting with technology like using drum breaks and stuff, but programming something like that was really, really new to me. But yeah, once I got my thing together and once I knew what I was doing with my sort of one-man band approach, then I just shamelessly plug in all the charities. I started working with a charity called Attitude is Everything, who were doing amazing work to make music more accessible for audiences. But what they were trying to do at that time was think about it from an artist perspective. And for the first time, they had the idea of a headline tour. What would a tour look like if the artist headlining it was disabled? What would that mean in terms of access? And they partnered with Independent Venue Week in the UK, which is a thing that runs at the end of January, celebrating that kind of grassroots, up to sort of 200 capacity. Those great venues where where everyone comes up through. So that was my sort of big break, really. I got offered that tour, got a bit of Arts Council funding to put it together. And yeah, it was just the idea, just the speed at which it went from, bottom of the bill at an acoustic night in Digbeth to 10 people to, packing out places like the Half Moon in Putney. That's the one, Half Moon in Putney, a place where everyone's been through, whether it's all the big bands. They've got pictures of U2 and the Stones and all sorts on their walls. And yeah, I mean, for me, that sort of scale up was pretty rapid. And then there was like the TV things and I'm in Sainsbury's and people are like, you're that guy with the gloves. It's like, right, okay. So it really got people's imagination. But yeah, as I say, there was also this kind of problem of like, hey, we fixed it.
Yeah, because I think of something like an acoustic guitar and the number of ways in which you can play that and the different approaches to it and how expressive that is of somebody's, what somebody's trying to get out as a musician. And I wonder if something like the gloves can have that level of expressivity, if that's the word.
Yeah, they've definitely evolved in that sense. You're battling with there's two things to that, really. There's the amount of information the gloves can gather about your movement, and then it's also the quality of the software instrument and how much thought went into the expressiveness at that end. Because if it's, I do get asked this a lot about, people say to me like, oh, the gloves sound really good, don't they? But they don't actually have any inherent sound. They're just a controller. They're just churning out MIDI information based on movement. So you need instruments that are expressive enough, that have sampled. You have sampled instruments now, which I use a lot of. They've been around for a good few years, where you've got like, you'll have a concert piano and somebody has gone to the trouble of playing every single note at every possible velocity. So you've got every nuanced way of every note being hit. It has things, what's called a round robin. So you play one note and you play the same note again, it won't play exactly the same piece of audio because the ear knows that they're hearing something repeating. Because our ears are much more sophisticated to this stuff than people would realise. And it's really easy to... It's like bad CGI in a film. You know, if you hear a software instrument that's off, then it just takes you out of the song. So you have to pair it with that right kind of stuff. But in terms of expressivity, yeah, I think as well, it depends on the instrument. I mean, a guitar is a really fickle thing because there's so much nuance in, like I said, before the Gloves, I was making a record that was kind of in debt to local hero Nick Drake. And I would listen to Pink Moon and I think I know all these guitar parts really, really well. And then I would notice mistakes, if you want to call them mistakes, little things, notes, timing issues, or maybe like a bit of fret buzz or something. And those kind of instruments, the more kind of nuance for that kind of stuff, that's much harder to recreate digitally, you know.
Sure. Like
a piano seems to lend itself quite well, drums that lend themselves quite well. And then that in itself took my music on a bit of a journey because a synthesizer is easier to manipulate with a glove than, you know, a guitar. So the sound of the music was then kind of very quickly informed by the technology as well.
Right. Which brings me to, because we've spent the last half an hour talking about how you make music and why you make music that way. Let's talk about your music. Let's start with what's Winter of 82, what's Dyskinetic, how do these things fit together?
Oh, yeah, there's so many things. So Winter of 82 was the kind of... It was loosely a solo project, and then it kind of quickly became like a duo thing. So that was just kind of fairly straightforward, kind of indie-ish. We're kind of into, you know, we're 90s kids, so we were, you know, listening to OK Computer and, you know, talking about the Beatles and things and blah, blah, blah. So we were... Yeah, I don't know. That was kind of an interesting chapter. I'm massively underselling it because it seems like 100 years ago. But I had a record out as Winter of 82 called Bless This House, which made a little bit of noise. This is all pre-Gloves. Tom Robinson was playing it quite a bit on BBC Six. So, you know, it sounded like a thing that was supposed to be on the radio at that time. Dyskinetic was, obviously, it's much more the kind of solo stuff. What I felt very clearly, apart from the fact that Lee and I didn't have time to make records together so much, weirdly because Lee was...
Sorry, Lee.
Lee Cogswell was my sort of musical partner in Winter of 82, who also directed the film The Gloves Are On, because he then came on tour with me, because he's now a really super successful director of documentaries and things. He's got... I think this is news. He's got a thing about the Style Council coming out on Sky. I'm sure I'm allowed to say that now because it's been advertised. So he's doing really well. But one of the first documentaries he ever made was the one about me, which is called The Gloves Are On, and he came on tour with me. But yeah, so we weren't doing the band thing so much at that time because we were just really stretched out with this. And I felt that, for one thing, the name itself is, looking back, it's like Winter of 82. It's in the past. And yeah, so Dyskinetic was born out of like, just acknowledging that I couldn't sort of shoehorn my slightly funky kind of indie guitar pop into this glove format, into these digital realms. It just seemed silly to say, oh, this is Winter of 82 and it's kind of turned into this. I felt like, no, this is kind of a whole other beginning in terms of how I make music. So Dyskinetic was kind of the rebranding exercise that I undertook, a couple of years ago, to be like, right, this is how I make music now. And it's going to sound quite different to that other thing that you've been following. Apologies in advance, but this is where we're going. And people seem to be okay with that.
How do you describe it to people?
So one of the things for me is, like, obviously the name Dyskinetic came from, I thought I was clever enough to have made up a word. I was like thinking about the movement being impaired, right? But then I discovered that it's an Americanism for cerebral palsy. It's often described as dyskinetic. So it's actually a medical term. And I thought, well, how neat is that? I mean, the music making itself is born out of this impairment, which is literally dyskinetic. So it seemed like a good serendipitous bit of branding, because the movement that I have, or the impaired movement that I have, is the thing that informs composition. It informs how the music is performed, and I really liked the idea of it being so literal. And also, in terms of the music, I guess it's like I'm wearing a lot of my influences. One of the things I was trying to solve with Dyskinetic, which I think I did quite well on the last thing that I released, Koi no Yakin, was I was really into metal as a kid, and I got really back into very heavy metal much later on. A few years ago, I went to see Metallica expecting to be wearing my nostalgia glasses and just being like, this is it. I want to do this. How do I do this? This is just having this mind-blown near religious experience. And I was like, why is it that only dudes are allowed, like dudes with guitars? Why have they got the monopoly on heavy? Why can't like a digital thing be heavy, you know? So I was trying to solve those kind of things. What's the DNA of my musical roots between very kind of harmonically ambitious stuff like the way Imogen had influenced me with Frou Frou, being a singer-songwriter who likes to play on the sort of darker side of things, you know, being up to my ears in Radiohead and REM and Smashing Pumpkins as a teenager, and also like, how do you get some weight behind it? One of the things that kind of frustrated me on the tour was it was going really, really well. I mean, for some context, I booked that tour, which the first leg of the UK thing ended at the Half Moon in Putney, which was the biggest gig I'd ever played, but that was booked as like a week-long thing. And then people started ringing. You got in touch. You had me out in Berlin, which was like, what? How is this happening? And then stuff like that just kept happening. And I was going around. I didn't have time to change anything because it takes ages to program anything with the gloves. So I was going around with this thing that I put together for like a few gigs in the UK. And then a year later, I'm still flying around doing the same kind of set. And I was getting increasingly dissatisfied with it. And then I had the gig offer that was like, right, this is my chance to kill it. I'm going to like, you know, as my mate Grant, he was like, you're doing so well. Why now? Why shoot the cash cow now? You're doing amazingly well. I was like, no, it's got to stop now. I'm really not artistically that happy. So I headlined the Millennium Stage at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. about 18 months after that first gig in the UK. I was like, right, this is, you know, for something that was a week-long experiment to be, you know, flying to the US 18 months later. They told me afterwards that these are the free concerts they have at the Kennedy Center, and they told me afterwards that the last crowd to break mine in terms of attendance was Norah Jones, and I was expecting like 5 people, and this was silly. This is just like a sea of people. Wow. And that was the end of it. I went, right, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm killing this show, as it was called, The Gloves Are On, because I just didn't like the sound. I didn't like that I'd tried to take my kind of indie guitar songwriting stuff and I'd had to sort of pack it into sounds that I could get my head around making with the gloves. I felt like it sounded quite amateur, you know. I felt like it was very kind of Ableton, like my first day with Ableton. I hadn't used Ableton Live, for example, when I started this. Right. So I felt like I sounded pretty amateur compared to some of the stuff that was out there. And I was like, right, I've got to rethink this. And that was when I got back to the idea of what are the problems I want to solve? Well, I don't want to make this sound. How do I make it heavier? What do I, you know, and that's when it started to feel like it has to be a new thing. I have to kind of reboot and rebrand. And that's where Dyskinetic kind of became the thing.
Right. Because I was watching the video for Koe no Yokan just before we did this interview. And two things really stood out. One is you get quite power chordsy on it, which is very cool.
That's always been the ambition. Like, how do you make this really rock? Yeah. Do you know Robin Valk?
Oh, very well, yeah.
Okay, great. So, the problem has always been on my mind because when I first got them home...
Sorry, just not everybody listening will, though, so we should probably say
so I'm just going to talk as if it's just between you and I. Robin Valk is he was former head of BRMB many years ago. He was on Rhubarb Radio at this time. He's just a bit of a Birmingham-based champion of new music.
But has been for many, many years. I mean, he's a local radio legend for decades, but also a consultant for how radio stations should pick their music. So, yeah. So that's Robin Valk.
Yeah, and a massive, massive champion of mine long before the gloves came along. The first person outside of my little bubble to be like, yeah, this is great. You've really got something. And he came and he interviewed me for his podcast at the time. And when I'd got the gloves home, my partner was like, I'd showed her what they could do. And then she said to me, yeah, it's cool, but is it metal? And I was like, oh, that's an interesting question. And I relayed this to Robin at the time. This is just a few weeks later. And Robin was like, it's totally metal. It's so metal. It's so big shapes and power chords. It's obviously metal. I was like,
not only that, but I'm a cyborg now.
yeah. And then so that sound that I had on that first tour, I felt like I'm not delivering on this at all. So yeah, finally to get that big smashing heavy thing working.
Right. So the second thing that really struck me about Koi no Yokan is that there's a Japanese influence. And you went to Japan with Drake Music, and you've got Japanese tattoos I can see on your arm. And so there's an influence going on there. Talk a little bit about the influence.
Yeah, the Japanese thing, I could talk about this all day. It's been a massive, massive influence on me. And I'm not even sure what it began as, because it's been there for so long. There was just something about so I flunked out of music college to do there's a confession, that's public for the first time, but I totally flunked music, and I went and did art, and I, on the basis that, like, you know, David Bowie went to art college, I'm sure this will make me a better musician, I'm going to art college. I have no talent for art at all. Remember being obsessed with Japanese typography. I was just obsessed with, there's just so many things about Japanese culture that really fascinated me. You know, I was really into like the yo thing before anyone ever knew what I was talking about. There was just like a big, there's also some, we could get really deep on this. There was some big spiritual stuff going on in my life as a teenager. I was really influenced by meditation and some of the spiritual aspects of what was coming out of Japan. This is like really early on when I was like 13, 14. Because I left home when I was 13 to go and live with some people who were really out there, meditating and Reiki healing and all that kind of stuff. So I had quite a strange tangent that I went on with that.
Let's sort of just go down that tangent just a little bit, because that's got to be a formative influence on everything you do. You know, like leaving home that young.
Yeah, it seems weird saying it now. So my parents were separated, and I just had this. I remember my best mate when I was about 10. He said to me, "Look, if my parents ever split up, I ain't taking sides. I'm out of there." And then it happened in my family, and I went, "No, that's a great idea. I'm out of here, and this is ridiculous." Why? I thought, yeah, fine, I can go out on my own, and I found fell in with a crowd that meant that I could. So yeah, really weird, scary decision to make. I have a 6-year-old. My oldest son is 6. The thought of him leaving home in 7 years' time is like, what? I actually did that? That seems intense. So I was living in this house where there were like small sort of disclaimer, I'm not sure that I'm not standing by this stuff now. I think I'm a little more scientific in my old age, but it was big on Reiki healing, which is a big thing that's a big Japanese influence. It was really out there. I didn't go to school much. I just thought I could meditate and play guitar and, sort my life out that way. I didn't have time for such silly distractions as my parents getting divorced and also going to school. What an obvious waste of my time when there's, riffs to learn, songs to write, and spiritual journeys to go on. None of this is an endorsement, by the way, of anything that I'm definitely saying you should stay in school, kids.
This is just a description of what happened.
Yeah. I thought I was one of those kids. I thought I knew it all. I was like, I don't need this system.
Right. And do you?
Do I know it all? Definitely not.
Yeah.
Definitely not anymore. The more you know, the more you know you don't know enough, right?
Sure.
Something like that.
Tell me about it.
Yeah. I think that's the thing. You feel less. The more you learn, you feel less and less confident. But that's the way to live, right? You need to be inquisitive and not so sure and trust, question your instincts sometimes. And
So I'll release you from this diversion a little bit. You were in art school, interested in Japan.
Where was I doing that? Oh, yeah. So we're talking about Japan, weirdly enough. Yes. So, just a big fascination with Japan and Japanese culture. And it's always just been, and I didn't really know why. There was just always this pull of like this feeling of wanting to be in Japan. And then I got the call. I remember I did a demo in London, and some people from the the British Council in Japan were over visiting and looking at stuff. And they saw me perform, and then there was a bit of buzz, and people were like, "Oh yeah, you should expect a call." they really liked you. And then a couple of years passed and I was like, oh, that Japan thing just never happened, did it? And then like a week later, it was like, oh, are you up for this? Can you come to like Tokyo fairly soon? So I was going to Japan and there was this incredible sense of being in Japan and feeling like it couldn't be more different to where I'm from. Like there was nothing familiar, language or anything. And yet it felt really familiar. And I felt like getting off that plane and just going out. We got there in like late afternoon. So we were just wandering around like tourists in Kawasaki City. And I just thought, I know this place. But not only did I know this place, but I felt like this place got me, There was a really strong and really powerful connection with Japan that became... that obsession then really started and really fueled, because I felt that there were just so many things happening for me while I was there. One of the things that's really exciting and I think is relevant in the world that we're talking about with music technology, like I often find when I'm performing, like I say, I went to art college. This is art with a capital A. At the risk of, I'll die on that hill, man. I might be a bit pretentious for some people, but this, I'm trying my best here. This is meant to be, the real thing. And, I pour so much into these performances, and then you finish a song, and then people in the UK are like, so is it Bluetooth or Wi-Fi? And you're like, okay, that's not what we're here to talk about. That's not what I'm doing here. This isn't a tech demo. This is, And in Japan, it was like nobody cared about the technology. Nobody saw that it was technology. All the questions and all the discussion was about the movement and the story and how graceful it was. And they seemed to just see it as art. And I think, obviously, it's not a cliche to say that in Japan, relationship with technology is different to how it is in the West. And I think that the idea of a gestural technology like this probably seemed like less impressive. Like the idea of, from a technical point of view, it just seemed like there was like, oh yeah, we get what the tech is, but isn't it beautiful? Doesn't it work amazingly well? And that connection with that audience felt really, really good and really strong and really validated actually what I was trying to do, because I did feel like for a long time some of that stuff was not landing. Do you know what I mean? Because I'm just like,
sure.
Oh, okay, cool. I'm really trying here. And it's like, oh, are you on 5G router? So, I don't care. Sorry to disappoint, but yeah.
Well, what's really interesting is, apart from the sort of the grace of the movement that was discussed, the idea of it as narrative is kind of interesting, because you describe yourself on your website as essentially a storyteller.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Because it's funny you asked me that now, because this has been sort of opened as a more of a professional discussion now. I've had some consultation and a bit of stuff going on with my career plan. I should plug, I had some funding during lockdown from Help Musicians UK. One of the things they did was hook me up with some business consultants. I've had some advice, social media strategies and blah, blah, blah. One of the things we kept talking about was the idea that it is a story ultimately, and that music... Like I could see really early on that people were engaging with this, what I was doing, as a story, as an event that wasn't necessarily about the music. And I've always been totally fine with that. People always say to me, oh, it's such a great story. They don't say to me, you make great music. It's not that they don't like my music. They talk about my music. But even people who I know really like my music will come back to, it's just such a great story, And it's kind of, it's like, those are the words that I always come back to. It feels like a narrative. It feels like a thing that's happening. It all sounds, it sounds good in an interview to be able to say, I was on, like, gives good quote when I say that my career was on the rocks and I'm really kind of on the ropes. But I'm not exaggerating. I was done for with this stuff, because I just couldn't play anything. So the idea... Yeah, I mean, I get it. It's cute, an artist that
Does it have a happy ending or is it going somewhere?
I don't know yet, I guess. I hope so. I mean, the fact that one of my favourite artists came up with this technology and, got hooked up to do this, and then, all the things that started happening and the phone kept ringing. It's been a hell of an adventure. I don't know that... the thing that I'm obsessing over at the moment is I've really lived for the transient nature of it. And so I've just been really in the moment, going and playing all these shows and doing all these talks. And then the lockdown thing happens and it all just stops. And I realised that I didn't have a lot of stuff that was kind of set in stone. One of the things that came from these Help Musicians UK meetings was how thin the back catalogue is, for example, you know. And that frustrates people, and I sympathise with that when people say to, you know, mates are like, I love this song, you know, a particular song that I play in the show, and it's like, why can't I hear it on Spotify? And it's just not been in my headspace to do anything about that. I've just enjoyed being in the moment and having a break from thinking about recording songs, because I had such big anxiety about performing live, that was all wrapped up in, I now realise, wrapped up in my impairment and the amount of access barriers I was facing on stage. So getting over that, having that anxiety lifted, and because the technology allowed me to get over those things. Because, I mean, this is the really weird thing for me is it's real seat of your pants stuff in terms of like the gloves. My first pair of gloves, they're like prototypes. They're very, it was a little shaky at times, and it's gone wrong in front of big crowds and stuff. And I used to think like people are just going to boo me if this doesn't work. But the opposite thing happened. People really got behind the idea. People seemed to get that it was bleeding edge stuff and that it wasn't always going to work. And, you know, we got through it. I remember before that first tour sitting around Imogen's, and she was like, but are you really going to do the whole thing just with the gloves? Like, she wasn't sure that they were ready for that, because no one had done a headline tour where, you know, the gloves were the only instrument. There was no safety net for that thing. There were no backing tracks. There were no guitars I couldn't do anyway. So if it hadn't have worked, it was just, and it mostly worked. But the fact that it didn't work perfectly actually wasn't a problem. People totally got with that.
And I guess that is what made it part of the story. Yeah,
I think so. The fact that it was... I remember doing a thing, I'm just sound like I'm being really nostalgic about you can tell I've been in for 4 months. Like, I did a thing at Abbey Road. It was a big event, performing, and I was doing like drum loop things, and I made a mistake, and then it got stuck in the loop. And I just was like, hey, well, I guess you know it's live, right? And somebody came up to me after, and it was like, that's the best thing ever, the fact that you made a mistake. And he said, I thought it was just the music plays and you do an interpretive dance. I didn't know you were actually... It's like, oh, yeah, no, I'm really busting a gut up there. Like, it's really real. So, yeah, I guess it gave people some confidence in it, that it was like... Because that's the thing that people always say to me is like, but you could... I've got a little bit of a troll on YouTube. He's like, but you could just mime. Why? How do we know this is real?
Yeah.
Like, you're just going to have to take my word for it at this point. I guess I can't convince you, but, you know...
Yeah.
It's a real thing.
So what's post-lockdown for you? What's the next chapter?
Well, I think the problem with the situation at the moment is obviously we don't know where travel is. It's forced me to look at things in a new way. Obviously, I am actually recording music, which is exciting. I feel like I'm able to get my head around that. With the Help Musicians UK funding, I was looking to... Like everyone is all being asked the same question, like, how do you do, you know, can you do it on the internet? What can you do online? So, as I said at the start, I didn't want to rush into that, but now I'm getting set up with, you know, I've been able to, with the funding, I've been able to get a home studio. I didn't have a home studio at all. Like, I rent a studio. So when this started, I had no way of doing anything, actually.
Right.
Because I can't go to my studio at the moment, obviously. So I had to get started again with working from home, and I've, you know, got a bit of a setup now with the cameras and things, leading towards the inevitable thing, because the inquiries are now coming to perform and do stuff, do events, but do them remotely. I've got some talks and gigs coming up, actually, which are going to be happening like right here. And that is cool, I suppose. That's strange. I mean, you know, it's got to be done. We've got to find ways around it. I mean, things aren't changing around live music anytime soon, are they? When's the next time we're going to do a gig?
That cuts down on your carbon emissions anyway.
Like, certainly here, I don't know what policies are like in different parts of the world, but here, I mean, you know, it's been made very clear with the changes to the lockdown over the last week or so that live music isn't changing. You know, there's not going to be any gigs. And people are adapting. My brother runs an events agency, and they've done a big production over the weekend of having bands and artists in a studio, and they've been streaming that, but it's been a real like high standard of production, and it's been interesting to watch that unfold. It's like, yeah, we've got to completely rethink this, and how do you make it look like something? Because for me, I'm very old-fashioned. I just like the engagement of meeting people, and, you know, I love going out and playing shows, and I'm all for hanging around, and, you know, people want hugs and selfies. I'm that guy. And so the idea that you just can't do any of that is like, oh, it's really scary. to me.
But to be fair, you're at a massive advantage over everybody else because you've already adapted to overcome a real serious challenge. And so you know how this plays out.
I should think about that, shouldn't I? I hadn't really thought about that. No, I'm just sort of nervously thinking about how to make it make sense on a screen, because that's just not completely new to me. I mean, I made the video with Josepha, the Koi no Yokan thing. I'm working with an ongoing project that I have at the moment is with my choreographer, Ayaka Takai, who has been... It's been interesting because we started that project remotely. She lives in Tokyo, so we've been doing this kind of thing for a long time anyway. So that was like the one aspect of my work that actually didn't change that much because we were already working remotely. But that's one of the things that we're talking about a lot at the moment in terms of like designing new work for the gloves, because this thing with Ayaka is about solving, for me, the problem of like, how do you really make it really refined? I wanted that apart, again, it was a Japanese influence of wanting something much more graceful and much more visually stimulating than just kind of, I think the early stuff that I did was very straightforward, like, I can point up and I can play a chord and I can point down and play a different chord, and I wanted something much more artistic, which is why I started working with Ayaka. And the extra layer to our work now is, what can we do in this movement that is relevant to the camera, and really thinking about where my hands are positioned and what that means visually, because all of the things that we've been working towards were stage-based performances,
Sure.
And we're obviously not doing that anytime soon. So thinking about this...
But all the ways that you're describing what you do now, you're describing a dancer.
Yeah.
Do you describe yourself as that?
I'm starting to. I mean, yeah, obviously, I had some Arts Council funding last year to support this partnership with Ayaka, and yeah, I just wanted to get... The problem got really wrapped around, and what was really interesting to me was like, I was playing music that I'd already thought about and then going, what can I use? How can I use the gloves to make those sounds come out? And I was like, okay, that's cool. And that's been fun and it's paid the bills. But now, how do we go at this the other way? What does my impaired movement sound like? How do we start with movement and then make movement informed composition? We design something that from a choreography perspective and then find out what that means as a way of composing music. Yeah. So that's been the brief for that. And yeah, I do think about it. And there's so much kind of funny irony to this because, like, I'm mobility impaired. I'm, a physically disabled person, usually sat on a stool, 5 years ago, sat on a stool in the corner of a pub, not moving around much, obviously. And, like, my whole show, the whole thing that I do, everything that I've worked for now is so physical. It's so demanding. I mean, like, I have to really think. I mean, I love it. I'm not complaining at all. But like, the nature of performing with the gloves has influenced, like, my exercise, my diet, my, whole fit. It's a full body thing to do.
Yeah.
I'm not sat, I can't, have like 3 pints and smoke 10 fags and sit on a stool and just churn out songs. It's like physically demanding work. And especially when you can see I'm being really nostalgic about this, but normally when you're traveling as well and you're dealing with time zones and stuff, you've got to be on top of your game. But I love that. For me, that's like a really exciting challenge. And I've always got really wrapped around this delicious kind of irony that, like, for someone who's lived with a physical impairment of being, kind of sheltered from physical activity, and then having this music becoming this really vigorous physical thing. It plays into a lot of stuff in my head about, I think it serves, these are the narratives that only serve me, but for me, it conquers a lot of stuff, in terms of like growing up feeling very weak and very vulnerable, and then going out on these big stages and throwing my massive rock star shapes. And it's like, yeah, that kid did all right, actually,
Brilliant. Kris, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you. It's been great. And yeah, hopefully not too... I'm sounding really glum about the lockdown thing, but hey, maybe we'll be allowed to go out and play some gigs soon. But in the meantime, I guess I'll be playing some gigs online soon.
Let us know when.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers, Kris. All right, have a good one.
Thank you.
That's Kris Halpin, and that's the MTF podcast. You can check out Kris's music at dyskinetic.com. I'll link to that in the show notes. And you can also see the video of his Koi no Yokan song on the podcast page too. The MTF podcast's out every Friday, so hit the subscribe button and that will turn up in your player of choice each week without you having to do or pay anything. You can also share, like, rate and review. And if you know someone who might find this interesting, feel free to mention it to them. The show was edited by Sergio Castillo with music by Tomas Novoa and Airtone, and Rani Dar, aka Run Dreamer, made the MTF audio logo. I'm Andrew Dubber, at Dubber on Twitter. Music Tech Fest is at Music Tech Fest absolutely everywhere. You have a great week, stay safe, and we'll talk soon. Cheers.